بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم له ملك السماوات والأرض يحيي ويميت وهو على كل شيء قدير هو الأول والآخر والظاهر والباطن وهو بكل شيء عليم.
أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين بارئ الخلائق أجمعين، ثم الصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا ومولانا وحبيب قلوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا وشفيع ذنوبنا أبي القاسم مصطفى محمد صلى الله عليه وآله أجمعين وأصحابه المنتجبين. أما بعد، قال الله تعالى في كتابه الكريم: ألف لام ميم الله لا إله إلا هو الحي القيوم. In the name of Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate. Respectable audience, distinguished listeners, honorable viewers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. As we in the previous lecture talked about the divine attributes, and we did categorize and classify Almighty Allah's attributes into two major categories. We did talk about the unity of Almighty Allah's essence, and it was said that the unity of Almighty Allah's essence, I mean Tawheed Dhati, bears two concepts. The first is that Almighty Allah is one, no partner should be associated to Almighty Allah. Another meaning for this, that Almighty Allah is one, it means that Almighty Allah is devoid of composition. And Almighty Allah is absolutely pure and absolutely simple. We mean basit. So these two meanings and these two definitions were presented for our dear viewers for the concept of Almighty Allah's unity, I mean Tawheed Dhati. Today, God willing, we are going to talk about the unity of Almighty Allah's attributes, or the unity of divine attributes. In other words, we mean Tawheed Sifati, the multiple attributes which are related to Almighty Allah. They are identical to Almighty Allah's essence. There is no meaning or no assumption should be there that Almighty Allah's essence and attributes are two different things. According to the Shia theologians, we believe that the divine attributes and essence are one, and they are not something different. Though conceptually talking, attributes are something different from what we define, from what we describe. As-sifa ghayr mawsuf. But this sifa or these attributes, in respect with different existence, it differs. When we are talking about the human beings, when we are talking about the contingent existence, for sure, we believe that the attributes are something other than what we describe by these attributes. As-sifa ghayr mawsuf. For example, when we are going to describe a human being, that he is knowledgeable, he is the father of Ali, for example, and he is a teacher, All these three attributes which we have related to him or which we have ascribed to him, that is other than his own essence, that is other than his own being. His being is fully independent from all these three ascriptions as we have given to him. His being and his existence is other than his knowledge, other than his profession being a teacher, and other than his relationship that he is father of Ali. But when we are talking about the necessary existent, it differs. We believe that when we are talking about Almighty Allah's attributes, when we are talking about the divine attributes such as life, such as power, and knowledge, all these three attributes are identical with Almighty Allah's essence. They're all identical with Almighty Allah's essence. They are inseparable. I mean, the divine attributes and His essence are inseparable. We cannot find an object, a quiddity, that this object should be imposed on that. So, in contingent and possible existence, we can find two different categories, two different things, such as quiddity and existence, philosophically talking. Or logically talking, we can find in genus and we can find differentiate, or jins and fasl. Philosophically talking, we can differentiate between quiddity and existence. When we are talking about Almighty Allah, He does not have any quiddity. He is bereft of every kind of quiddity. There is no other thing that should be imposed on Almighty Allah's existence. Almighty Allah is pure existence. There is no other thing that should be referred to Almighty Allah. And due to His pure existence, He should be thought as absolute being, as necessary existent. Otherwise, we cannot say that He is a necessary existence, but He stands in need of the quiddities or properties, these and that. So, respectable audience and distinguished listeners, we have to be precise, we have to be very, very keen in this respect, that when we are talking about Almighty Allah's attributes, when we are talking about the divine attributes, such as knowledge, power, and life, though conceptually talking, these three attributes are different. In respect with Almighty Allah's essence, they are identical with Almighty Allah. They are not something other than Almighty Allah's essence. And due to this, Almighty Allah stands as source of knowledge. Almighty Allah stands as source of life. Almighty Allah is the source of each and everything.
لا إله إلا هو الملك القدوس السلام المؤمن المهيمن العزيز الجبار المتكبر سبحان الله عما يشركون والله الخالق البارئ المصور.
In the contingent life, you know that they barely stand in need of Almighty Allah's blessings as strong as they stand in need of Almighty Allah's blessing in their continuation of life. Not only they need Almighty Allah's blessing in their origination, in their beginning, but also they need Almighty Allah's favor and mercy in their continuity, in their continuation of life. Theologically talking, the Shiite theologians are of the view that there is no separation between Almighty Allah's attributes and that of His existence and that of His essence. There is no separation. They are identical and they are one. Let us talk that there can be some two different kinds of composition, I mean tarkeeb. Sometimes tarkeeb or composition is of external kind. For example, a book is composed of different constituents. In respect with the food, the same can be applied, the same analogy can be made, that different kinds of elements are working and join and then constitute food. So it is called external composition, that different components we put together and constitute one thing. A more complicated composition can also be imagined, and that is rational composition. Rational composition means that something should be made of two different things, but these things cannot be externally touched. Rather, they can be thought, they can be imagined. They cannot be found in the external world as facts. For example, logically talking, as it was said, we can say that when we define a human, so this definition of ours might be composed of, logically talking, genus and differentia. Philosophically talking, every contingent being is composed of existence and quiddity. These two components or these two elements can be differentiated, but not in the external world. In the external world, we find only one human being. But if you think deeply, if you ponder upon the human being's essence, you can find that there is matter, there is quiddity, and there is existence. And these two different components are different with one another. But in respect with Almighty Allah, none of these composition can work. Neither Almighty Allah is composed of different components from the external world, that we should say that Almighty Allah stands in need of these components, nor Almighty Allah is composed of some complicated components or somewhat rationally talking components. For example, that Almighty Allah should be composed of form and matter, or Almighty Allah should be composed of quiddity and existence. None of these suppositions and none of these assumptions can work with Almighty Allah. None of them holds true for Almighty Allah. Since we could prove that Almighty Allah is pure existence and His existence is of necessary kind, and thirdly, His existence is absolute, for sure Almighty Allah does not stand in need of form, quiddity, material, properties, these and that. So Almighty Allah's attributes or the divine attributes are identical with His essence. So, respectable audience and distinguished listeners, we did say that there are variety of opinions in respect with the divine attributes amongst the Muslim theologians and scholars. You know, there are some three important schools of thought, I mean theological schools of thought during the history. For example, there are some Mu'tazilite theologians, they have their own opinion in respect with the divine attributes. There are some Ash'arites theologians and they have their own particular vision of Almighty Allah's attributes. Beside these two factions and groups, another important school of thought stands, and that is the Shiite schools of thought, the Shiite theological opinion in respect with the divine attributes. The Shiite theological position was made clear that the divine attributes are one and identical with Almighty Allah's essence. They are inseparable. We should never ever think that the divine attributes are something other than Almighty Allah's essence. For there are some false and faulty implications that we cannot commit ourselves to those implications if we believe that Almighty Allah's essence is something other than Almighty Allah's attributes. So, due to this illogical and irrational implications, the Shia theologians have tended towards thinking that they should be one and they should be identical. I mean the attributes and essence. Though we did talk about this, that when we ascribe a contingent being, we believe that the attribute and essence are two different things. So there are some theories, I mean the Ash'arite and the Mu'tazilite theological opinions and vision in this respect. Now we would like to have a brief look at their position in this respect, and then God willing we will have a critical appraisal of their view that Almighty Allah's essence is something different with Almighty Allah's attributes.
إن الله يأمر بالعدل والإحسان وإيتاء ذي القربى وينهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر والبغي يعظكم لعلكم تذكرون.
They actually think that from one side we should believe that Almighty Allah possesses life, power, and knowledge. On the other hand, they believe that the mawsuf, what we describe, it is something different from attribute, from sifa. They could not solve this challenge, or they could not overcome this dilemma. On the one hand, they should believe that sifa is other than mawsuf. On the other hand, Almighty Allah should not be bereft of all the attributes. So they believe that Almighty Allah's essence represent His attributes. If we ask them, so then what are the position of the attributes with Almighty Allah's essence, they believe that we cannot differentiate between ascription of attributes to contingent existence and to that of the necessary existence. So this very, very subtle difference was outlined by the Shia scholars, that we should differentiate between referring these attributes to a contingent being and to that of the necessary being. If we describe a contingent being, at that time we believe that attributes are other than the essence. But when we are talking about the necessary being, his attributes are identical with his essence. His attributes are identical with his essence. But they have ignored, or they have overlooked this very important subtle point. And due to this, they could not solve this problem. So they say that on one hand, we should describe Almighty Allah with life, that He is a living. Otherwise, if He is not a living, then He should be dead. For death and life, there is some contradictory relation between these two. A person cannot be both a living and a dead. So they believe that on the one hand, we are to ascribe or we are to refer to Almighty Allah with these attributes. On the other hand, we believe that Mawsuf, or what we are going to define or what we are going to describe, that is something other than the attributes. Abstractly talking, essence is something other than the attributes. They could not solve, and they have given this solution that Almighty Allah's essence represent all those attributes. So we will have a critical appraisal of this notion, that this notion of the Mu'tazilite theologians does not seem true. So respectable audience and distinguished listeners, there are some three major theological schools in respect with the divine attributes. One of them is the Mu'tazilite, the second is the Ash'arite, and the third and the final is the Shiite, the Shiite theological schools of thought. They have their own particular understanding and comprehension of the divine attributes. So we talked about the Mu'tazilite notion of Almighty Allah's attributes. And later on, we will have a critical appraisal of their notion. So now coming to the Ash'arite theological position in respect with the divine attributes, they also believe in multiplicity of Almighty Allah's attributes and His essence. They also lack the notion the Shiites favor, or the Shiites defend. The Shiites believe that Almighty Allah's attributes and His essence are one. They are identical. They are inseparable. So that we should not fall victim to those false and irrational implications. If we believe that they are two, then these two would be in need of one another, and it is something against our belief that Almighty Allah is absolutely rich and absolutely needless. So respectable audience, the Ash'arite theologians also are of the view, since attributes are other than essence, so Almighty Allah's attributes should be other than Almighty Allah's essence. Their explanation or their exposition is very much similar to that of the Mu'tazilite theologians. So they have the same notion that since we cannot say that Almighty Allah is a lifeless being, or since we cannot say that Almighty Allah is a powerless creator, and since we cannot dare say that Almighty Allah does not have knowledge and or power, or He does not have life, we should say that Almighty Allah is living, Almighty Allah is powerful, Almighty Allah is knowledgeable. But how to solve this problem, that either His essence is similar to that of His attributes or not? Their position and their response to this question is positive.
لا إله إلا هو الملك القدوس السلام المؤمن المهيمن العزيز الجبار المتكبر سبحان الله عما يشركون والله الخالق البارئ المصور.
The response to this question, that either Almighty Allah's essence and attributes are one or two, they have chosen the second. They say that they are two. Why? Because they have made this false analogy in respect with the contingent being. They say when you describe a creature, a human, with different attributes, then you for sure believe that His knowledge is other than His existence. His form is other than His matter. His quiddity is other than His existence. So this analogy derailed them from the right path, and they say that Almighty Allah's essence should also be other than His attributes. While according to the Shi'at, we believe that reference of the attributes, it makes difference whether you define a contingent being or a necessary existent. So respectable audience and distinguished listeners, the Mu'tazilite and the Ash'arite position in respect with the divine attributes seem extremely similar. They are of the view that when we are talking about the creature, the sifa, the attributes are other than essence. The very analogy should be applied to Almighty Allah. And Almighty Allah's attributes should be other than Almighty Allah's essence. So due to this, they have derailed from the right path. For we believe that according to the Shi'at position, according to the Shi'at theological understanding of these attributes, we believe that Almighty Allah is completely different from other existence. His existence is necessary. His existence is an absolute existence. So when we talk about a necessary existence, when we are talking about wajibul wujud, for sure, wajibul wujud is something other and totally different from those creatures, from those contingent existence, from those possible existence. Even referring the attributes to them is also different. When you refer to creatures, when you refer an attribute to a contingent being in existence, for sure, existence and quiddity is two phenomena or two different components. But in respect with Almighty Allah, since Almighty Allah is bereft of all properties of the contingent beings, since Almighty Allah is devoid of every kind of quiddities, for sure there is nothing except Almighty Allah's existence. Almighty Allah is pure existence. He is simple. He is basit. He does not accept any composition, whether this composition should be of external kind or that of the philosophical composition or logical composition. As I gave you the example, when you ask a logician that could you please define me the human beings, he would say, from the Aristotelian logic, he would say that al-insan haywanun natiq. So al-insan is the subject, haywanun natiq. This haywan is the genus, and natiq is the differentia, I mean fasal. So human being is composed of genus and differentia, logically talking. And philosophically talking, human being is composed of existence, I mean wujud, and quiddity, mahiyya. And these two are different. They are not totally one. They are not utterly one. But in respect with Almighty Allah, when we talk about Almighty Allah does not accept. Almighty Allah is not composed of genus and differentia, or existence and quiddity. And Almighty Allah is not composed of external components as that of a book, that a book is composed of different components. And there are different elements that constitute a book. So since all these properties do not work with Almighty Allah, we believe that Almighty Allah's attributes and essence are one and identical, and they are inseparable. May God bless all dear viewers and listeners, that Almighty Allah guide us in the straight path, and we have to truly understand all these concepts And then we have to apply them in our own practical life. For this, that he who does all these commandments in his life, for sure, a happy life and a happy aftermath will be awaiting for him. May God bless us all that we have to be the real followers of our Holy Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his household's glorious teachings. Thank you very much. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
اللهم انفعنا بالعلم وزينا بالحلم وجملنا بالعافية وكرمنا بالتقوى إن وليي الله الذي نزل الكتاب وهو يتولى الصالحين.